Well, we moved to Morgan from Peterson Lane here in Maryville in 1934. And that was at the time they were building the 411 highway. And we got to drive down on the new highway to Morgan. And the Morgan Mill down there was built in 1796. We owned that mill. And so there's only 16 families at that time living there in Morgan because the railroad came through Greenback and Morgan went toward Greenback. So we had a number of persons around Morgan. Everybody was playing with one another, and we had the passes, we had the Bordens, we had the Radfords, we had the Roberts family was there, and quite a few more of those families, and nobody did any work. All they did was farming.
Yeah. And that was John Cochran.
First of all, I'll say a few things about Morgan itself. The old mill property down there was 5 stories high and built by Hugh Kelso and his brother in 1796. That's the year Tennessee became a state. And so when we bought that mill down there, my dad had me out doing everything. I was 9 years old. At 11 years old, he had me out there grinding corn. And I got home from school. And so he showed me how to find the texture of meal with them big rocks made in France. And so he would take that meal, I would grind, and sell it to Alice Allen's boarding house in Maryville on Saturdays. He'd take a car road up there, and it was sold there at Alice Allen's boarding house because she was feeding a number of workers from Alcoa. They didn't have equipment. They had a mule barn up there with mules. And so I ground that cornmeal for the longest there. September the 9th, 1937, I was sleeping with Dad in the back bedroom of the old big house. And all of us just lit up like in daylight. I looked outside, the mill was burning to the ground. And we never know how it happened or whatever, but I had suspicions. Dad had wanted to put years later, he wanted to put one of those old dynamos, they called it, with electric lights in it, in that mill. And there was big batteries in there, and there was rats in there a foot long everywhere, all over the whole place. I always felt like that something happened that caused that mill to burn. So we cleaned up all them brick. They were handmade there on that local property, and there were pictures in those brick of hog feet and all that stuff. We sold all of those. Dad sold 2 of those mill rocks down there to Frank Hill. Mr. Hill, a good friend of mine, he wanted those mill rocks to put in his driveway, so Dad sold them to him for $10. They were made in France, and they're still down there.
Yeah, they're down there, just down the house.
Morgan had some interesting people there also. In the 30s and early 40s, we all went to the Presbyterian Church. And so there's a lot of evangelists came down there in that area, and they would spend days preaching and so forth. One guy in particular came down there from big school in Chicago, and there's Dr. Morum. And Dr. Morum would be preaching there. He stayed there for quite some time. One of the families that lived there, up there, they had a 16-foot, one-room building, the Radford family. And so there was 13 or 14 of them slept in that one room. And Joe was about our age, a great big husky individual. And so one day we were sitting out there. I talked to Preacher Norm, and Donald French was there, and Joe was there. And so Dr. Morum said, Joe, how do you all manage to sleep in that one-room building? He says, Preacher, like a bunch of so-and-so hogs. But it was quite interesting. There were a lot of different people that came there. E.D. Vining came there, and from up there also. And he wound up marrying Mrs. Griffith's daughter, Bessie Vining. Her final name was Bessie Vining. So she played the piano. Darlene took lessons from her playing the piano. But they didn't get along too well sometimes. And they had a farm worker, Cecil Goodman, lived there on the place. And one day I was sitting on the front porch, had some big brick pillars there on the front porch. So I looked out across the field there, beyond the old creek, and here went Bessie Vining down through there, she just hobbled along trying to run. They'd been into an argument. She was going to go to the river and jump in the river. And so right behind her, about maybe 15, 20 yards, was E.D. Vining, the preacher. He was trying to catch her. He couldn't catch her. And then here comes Cecil Goodman behind all of them, and he finally did corner them all and get them all together and brought them back to the house. So that was funny to see that. But anyway, Morgan had a lot of different personalities there. The Medlin family there run the old Morgan Mill for a while. And Dad always said that Mr. Medlin wanted to come out there and run the mill. Dad said, I don't need anybody to help run it. And he didn't like that. He wanted to work in that mill again. And then J.I. Simpson was a guy that had run the grocery store there. He sold a few things of merchandise and most of the groceries. And so one of the funny things was that people didn't have any money back in those days. And over in I'm going to go ahead and speak it, they called it Nigger Holler. Back across a big hill back in there. And there's a family lived over there called the Catons. And Mrs. Caton, bless her heart, she would bring 2 eggs, and she would walk back there in about 2.5 miles from where they lived to the grocery store. She'd carry them 2 eggs up there and swap them for snuff and baking soda and so forth. But she would stop at Mother's, and she'd come in there in the house, and she'd say to Mother, have you got a cup of coffee? And Mama said, oh, she had some coffee. She said, if you give me some coffee, I'll tell your portion. And she would pour that coffee drugs out in her hand and said, I'll tell you your portion.
How accurate was she?
Times were tough in those days. Yeah. But Morgan, finally, dissipated, but prior to that, there was 5 different boats that traveled up and down the Tennessee River from New Orleans and so forth, and they brought up dry goods, furniture, and other items, and they would use those old big Conestoga wagons and haul that stuff to Knoxville, on further north to Louisville, and so forth. And so General Sherman came up there in 1863 with 25,000 soldiers, and they couldn't cross the Tennessee River. So he commandeered those warehouses along there that held all those dry goods and so forth, and made rafts, and those soldiers all crossed the river there. In the river also was a Morgan ferry. It cost a quarter to cross that ferry to go to Loudon. And the house that they lived in there was a general's house. That's where he lived during the Civil War. So it was quite interesting. One of the things that was also interesting was people that carried the mail. They brought the mail up on those boats, and so there's a little place up on the river there called Tomotley. And Tomotley was a little post office up there, and those mail carriers be riding a horse with saddlebags, and they would go up through there one day and stop at Tomotley, going up to Calderwood, and then come back the following day on that horseback, delivering the mail. And Tomotley store up there was a big building, a warehouse, and also merchandise in there. And so this friend of mine, we worked together. He got a contract to tear that old building down. And in that building there was an H. Hammond tree. That's some of the relatives now, Thelma. Okay. Back in 1913, he had a ledger from back in Madisonville full of checks. And in that big book was about half his checks still in it. And so in there was where people would buy a nickel worth of snuff, chewing tobacco, dime, or whatever it was, and pay for it whenever they could. So he was going through all that, tearing it down. There, that big ledger was laying in there. And so he passed away. But his son and I were in the service together, and we worked together at the Ford dealer. And he came to me one day, he says, would you like to have that there ledger? I said, yes, I would. A lot of history in it. So, what did I do? I put it in the Greenback Museum. It's down there for people to see. And there's quite a story behind it. So, I'm proud of that.
You were mentioning Tomotley. What was the name of that community? Tomotley.
Tomotley starts with a T.
How do you spell that?
Now, Tomotley was an Indian name.
Tomotley.
But across the river there was an Indian reservation. Bill Kitchell lived down there toward Coy T, on that big farm down there. And so I was talking to him one day. He said, you know, we had a diversion down here. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, the Tennessee River there at Morganton said it flooded everything down through there. And there where we were at the mill, I've seen that water up nearly in the house, which is, I guess it was 15 foot deep or so, down in the old mill area, or maybe even deeper. And it covered like acres and acres of ground. So he told me, he said, all those timber cutters in North Carolina cut that timber up there, and during the spring, February and early March, and during those tides come, they would put those logs, float them down and put them in the river, and they would go down to New Orleans to be processed. He said there at the Kitchell farm, right down below Morgan right there, they put in 3 or 4 big anchors down in the bottom of the river there, and they tied some logs to those anchors, and when that flood came, those diversions would send those logs over into the bottomland there of the Kitchels, and it'd just be hundreds and hundreds of logs in there, which were tagged. And when the tide went down, they come in there in the summertime, and they would take those, identify them, and mark them, and put them into rafts, and roll them back in the river, and send them on to New Orleans. And he said those anchors and those diversions is still down there in that water. Never did pick them up. Most interesting stories I'd like to tell you while I'm sitting here. Easter time came around down there at the house. And the old house was built sometime in the 18th century, I guess. Weatherboard, whatever, and it was open. And so it came time for Easter. And those girls had colored Easter eggs before, and so they had a little bottle or box of red dye with little pills in it, and it was sitting on back what they call the parlor back there, up on the dresser. And this middle-aged sister, she was in there, they were going to color some Easter eggs during Easter, and she went in there and got that little box out, looked in there was a snake in that box. And the little box was about 3 inches long, and so she hollered. I went in there and got that box down, and there was a little snake about 1 foot long coiled up in that box. And I had to get out there under a tree and got a stick and killed it. But that was the most unusual thing to see a snake in a box like that. It got in that house somewhere during a cold winter, 1934 or 5. Well, we had to walk from Morgan up to Morgan School. Our grandparents, or our parents and grandparents, went to school there called Morgan Academy. And Morgan Academy was a well-known educational place. The fact is, they taught English, math, geometry, Spanish. Not too much Spanish, but they taught law, Bible, and a lot of other things in that school. I had aunts and uncles. All that whole family graduated 19 and 14. There at Morton. We went to school there in 4th and 5th grade. And Eva Black and Mary Ella Sweeney were the teachers there. We had to walk from here, I guess, from across the road over there somewhere to the spring to get a drink of water. And we had a potbelly stove, and of course, we had some outside johns parked out there on the outside. We had to go to the bathroom or whatever. And so 1936, I was fortunate. I went to the 6th grade, and Guy Hammontree had bought a new 37 model Chevrolet bus. It's a 1-ton truck that had a wooden body built on it with seats that run lengthwise inside. It was the grandest thing to get to ride that bus to school and not have to walk out in the snow and whatever. And so I was at Greenback School. And so Mr. Cooper was an ag teacher down there. And, you know, we always had demonstrations about doing things. So 1943, I guess it was, we got a joiner in up there, given to us by the federal government. And you planed that lumber on that joiner. And so that day we were sitting down in the classroom, and he pulled out that machine and showed us that thing. Now, fellas, this thing here is dangerous. You can get hurt seriously with it if you're not careful. I'm going to take this 2x4, and I'm going to show you how to use it. He run that 2x4 through there, lost that finger completely, back to the first joint. We had to haul him down to Alexander's, Dr. Alexander's, and have it sewed up. You know, he showed us how to do it.
He showed you how not to do it.
It wasn't funny, but back in those days, but it's funny to us later on. I was grinding that cornmeal right there for a lot of the customers down there at the old mill. G.I. Simpson owned that big store out there, and he would put us in about, I guess it was about 300 yards from where he had the store to the mill. So I was grinding on Saturdays or whatever. I was grinding the corn for meal. G.I. Simpson, he carried that bushel of corn on his shoulder every time he come to the mill. And so a bushel of corn weighed 56 pounds. But when you ground that meal, you should have 48 pounds of meal. We took out 6 pounds of toll to grind it. So he wound up with 48 pounds. Word got out on the community that I had shortchanged him. And so Dad came to me and said, son, word's out on the community that you shortchanged him. Said, I tell you what you do. Next time he comes to mill, you put a gallon or so of corn extra in there. Don't tell nobody, just put that in there and grind it, and we'll see what he says about that. That's the last we heard from him. I went to church up there also, 1947, 48, 49, and 50.
At the Presbyterian.
And I knew the whole gang of us in there. In the same group. That gave me a little testament when I left and went into the service. I still got it. But Kyle McCall, P.K. Greenway, Julius Daddy, and the King family, all those people like that, Joe Kerr Walker, and a bunch of them came in there in that church at the time. One of the most interesting things that happened there at Greenback, I worked for P.K. Greenway there at the Greenback Motor Company for 3 years, and we sold an Old Black Joe fertilizer. And of course it's outlawed, you know, the Old Black Joe. But anyway, those old farmers would come in there, and they would buy that Old Black Joe fertilizer in April and May, and so PK sold it to them, and we had a ledger about 2 foot long with those old farmers' names on it, and they would pay for that fertilizer in November and December and sold their tobacco. And so one day P.K. Greenback called me. He said, all those parts and everything is down there in my barn out of the old Greenback Motor Company. They're yours. So I went down there and I loaded up 3 truckloads of old parts and everything. And in that bunch of things with this ledger in that box of all them names on there. So I put that down in the basement of the house. I kept it there for years. And finally, when my wife passed away, well, I was down there with Darlene cleaning up the basement, and there that box was. So I sat down and looked at all them names in there. Every old farmer down there paid his bill. There wasn't nobody cheated anybody. Didn't cost them nothing to get the fertilizer. And so I got that out, looked at it, I was surprised. It's down in the museum. Times have certainly changed. When I went to Greenback school, we didn't know what football was. We didn't have nothing but a rag-made baseball. We played little baseball. But one of the most important things that we had was what we called mumbly peg. You ever hear of mumbly peg?
Oh, yeah.
You use a knife. Open up the blades, a 3-point knife. If it's set up on its head like this on the ground, it's 100 points. If it's down like that, it's 3/4. It's 250 points or whatever. Anyway, 500 points was the winner. You drove a match into the ground, and you had to root the peg if you lost. You get down to your teeth and pull that peg out. We played that. We also had marbles. We used the marbles. But I learned a lot when I went to work at PK Greenback. Come by the house one day, and I've been doing quite a bit of work on tractors, whatever, down there. He said, "Do you want to work in the garage?" I said, "I'd like to." So I went to work there, and I worked there until 1950. I got a call to go into service, so I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and I went down the line, and I wore a size 9 shoe, and that guy had me out a pair of 9.5 and a pair of 8s. I said, "I wear a size 9. He said, "You'll take what y'all give you." And so we were shipped out to Camp Pickett, Virginia, and I was up there, of course, had 6 weeks of basic training. After the 3rd week, they called me, come in to cut the commander. I went in there, and Captain Pratt said, "I see you had some experience. I'm sending you down to the motor pool to work down there in the shop." I went down there, and Captain Zuckus was in there in charge of the motor pool. He said, "I'm putting you in charge of a corporal and 2 PLCs." And I was a recruit. We went to work servicing all those vehicles right there, 164. We had trucks, command cars, jeeps, 3/4, 2 Sherman tanks. And I spent the winter of 1950 and 51, early 51, servicing all those vehicles. Today being the 5th of November, Tennessee played Kentucky down to 5 degrees above zero. I happened to be on a Saturday. I heard that on the radio. I was a Tennessee football fan. So I spent 2 years over there. I was in Eschwege, Germany, up on the Russian border, and I'd been up there to ordnance school, and so I thought, well, I'll go down to the NCO club, and I'll probably enjoy going down there for a little while. I went down there, and there was a guy behind the counter. I looked over there. I said, "By the way, you wouldn't have to be from Tennessee, would you? He said, do you know a little town called Von Orr? I said, you know one called Greenback. Well, we were in Von Orr quite often back in those days. And so it was Hugh Sloan's brother. And he was running that NCO club. So I got discharged in September of 1952. I come back home, and Jack Bruce, the guy that had the paperwork about Tamale, I went up there and checked him as a Ford dealer, and Mr. Cochran was in there, and he said, would you like a job? I said, yes. He said, you come to work in the morning. I said, it's on a Saturday. I said, I just got home yesterday. Would you care to wait till Monday? I went to work there as a Ford dealer, and I went to school, and I serviced the first automatic transmissions on the market with Ford. I spent 21 years with that, and when G.L. Goins was the president of Pellissippi, also the director in Blount County, he said, would you like to go to school, teach a class at school? I went home, and my wife taught 12th grade at Eagleton for years, and she said, you do what you want to do, that'll be fine with me. So I went to work at teaching school. I spent 17 years teaching school.
Where did you teach?
I was at the old Bethel School in Alcoa.
Okay.
The medical center is now, and William Blunt School, and I retired at Heritage.
Okay.
But I went back to school. I was 46 years old to the University of Tennessee. So you can do what you want to do if you have the willpower to go ahead and do it.
So you retired at Heritage High School?
Sir?
You retired at Heritage High School?
You retired at Heritage
Yes.
High School.
Okay.
I retired at Heritage, 1987.
Wow.
If the good Lord lets me live, I'll be 97, June the 23rd of 2022.
I did my student teaching at Heritage.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
You knew Jane Pesterfield?
But one of the things
That
about
was 1980.
Oh, well, she was there, I think.
Okay.
I use that information to pass on to those youngsters.
Sure.
I've got a lot of those young people that I still see periodically. You know, I've been teaching how it works out like that.
Mm-hmm.
So Jerry Hodge, a good friend of mine, was a Buick dealer. He called me here back 6 or 8 months ago, or maybe a year ago now. He said, I've got a young boy just got through Maryville High School. He wants to be a mechanical engineer or whatever. He said, would you help him out some? Paddlefoot Johnson had a J&T store there in Maryville for years, and they called him Paddlefoot for a reason. He wore size 17 shoes. And so when he died, it was a 53 model Buick sitting there in the basement. He got that car out and gave it to that boy. And he called me, he came down at the house, and he said, I need some information on this thing. So he said, will you help me? I said, yes, I will. I started helping him. He restored that engine, the transmission and all. He's driving that thing. And he's going to school down at Cochran now.
Wow.
So I'm just thrilled to help him out.
Sure.
So a lot of that stuff I haven't forgotten.
Yeah.
I've been fortunate.
That's great.